Picture this. You're 24, living in a beat-up trailer, mixing essential oils to pay rent, when your idiot brother crashes a stolen SUV into a 200-pound werewolf. The wolf lives. Your brother? Well, he's about to wish he hadn't. Because in the supernatural world, there are debts that money can't pay. Debts written in blood and moonlight. And when the most dangerous alpha in 3 states comes knocking on your door with glowing amber eyes and a smile that shows too many teeth, you learn real fast that some contracts aren't signed with ink. They're signed with your soul. This is the story of Mara Lowe, who discovered that sometimes the monster under your bed isn't there to hurt you. Sometimes he's there because you're the only thing standing between him and the darkness that's been hunting him his entire life. But every fairy tale has a price. And hers? Well, let's just say it involved a lot more than a glass slipper. So grab your favorite drink, get comfortable, and let me tell you about the night everything changed. The night Mara learned that some debts can only be paid in scent. Chapter 1, The World We Know. Let me paint you a picture of Mara Lowe's life before everything went sideways. Picture a girl who talks to plants like they're her best friends, because honestly, they usually are. Mara lived in what most people would generously call a mobile home, and what she called the tin can of broken dreams. But she'd turned that little space into something magical. Every surface was covered with glass bottles filled with oils that could calm a panic attack or help an insomniac finally rest. See, Mara had this gift, and I use that word loosely because gifts usually don't come with a side of social anxiety and a bank account that laughed at her. She could smell emotions. Not metaphorically. Literally. Fear smelled like copper pennies and cold sweat. Anger was all sulfur and burning rubber. Love. Love was warm vanilla and fresh rain. And sadness. Sadness was the worst. It smelled like flowers left too long in stagnant water. Most humans couldn't detect these scents, but the supernatural community? They noticed. Which is how a broke perfume chemist ended up with a clientele of very wealthy, very dangerous creatures who paid premium prices for her custom blends. Her brother Jace was, well, let's call him work in progress and leave it at that. 26 years old with the decision-making skills of a drunk teenager and the survival instincts of a lemming. He'd been crashing on her couch for 3 months, supposedly looking for work, but mostly just eating her food and leaving empty beer cans as modern art installations throughout her tiny home. Just until I get back on my feet, Mar, he'd say with that boyish grin that had gotten him out of trouble their entire lives. What Mara didn't know, what she couldn't have known, was that Jace had been borrowing money from some very unfriendly people. The kind of people who charged interest in fingers rather than percentages. The kind who didn't accept, "I'll pay you next week," as a business plan. And when you owe money to loan sharks, sometimes you do desperate things. Like steal a car from a werewolf pack during a full moon. Now, before we go any further, let me explain something about werewolf pack law. It's not complicated, but it is absolute. You damage pack property? You pay pack prices. You injure a pack member? You owe pack justice. And pack justice comes in exactly 2 flavors, blood or bride. Chapter 2, The Crash. It was 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday when Mara's life exploded. She was in her makeshift lab, really just her kitchen table covered with beakers and bottles, working on a custom blend for a vampire who'd been having trouble sleeping through the day. Lavender base, chamomile top notes, with just a hint of something she'd never been able to identify, but that worked like magic on the undead. The knock on her door wasn't the polite tap-tap of a neighbor or the official rap of law enforcement. This was the kind of knock that said, "Open up or I'll open it for you." Mara wiped her hands on her jeans, noting absently that they were shaking. The scent signature outside her door was complicated. Alpha male, definitely. Power rolled off him in waves that she could smell even through the walls. But underneath the obvious dominance and barely restrained violence, there was something else. Pain. Old pain, like a wound that had healed wrong and now ached when it rained. She opened the door and came face to face with the most beautiful man she'd ever seen. Which should have been her first warning, because in Mara's experience, beautiful men were usually trouble. Beautiful men with glowing amber eyes and the kind of smile that made you think about running? They were catastrophe with good bone structure. Mara Lowe? His voice was whiskey and smoke, the kind that made you want to lean closer, even when every instinct screamed at you to run. That's me. She managed to keep her voice steady, which was a minor miracle considering her knees had apparently turned to jello. My name is Caden Voss. I believe we need to discuss your brother's debt. Here's what Mara learned in the next 10 minutes. First, her brother had stolen a 2023 Mercedes G-Wagon from the parking lot of Lunar, the most exclusive supernatural nightclub in the city. Not just any car, Alpha Caden's car. The one with custom bulletproof glass and GPS tracking that Jace had apparently been too high to notice. Second, during his joyride, Jace had crashed into a tree. Said tree happened to be in the middle of a pack run, and said crash happened to send one very large, very expensive beta, Werewolf, to the emergency vet with 3 broken ribs and a concussion. Third, pack law was older than human law, more binding than any contract, and absolutely non-negotiable. Jace owed a life debt. The traditional payment was either blood, meaning Jace would fight the injured beta until one of them stopped breathing, or bride, meaning Jace would offer up a female family member to serve the pack until the debt was considered settled. The problem, Caden said, settling into her tiny living room like a panther who'd decided her couch was his new territory, is that your brother is sick. Mara felt the bottom drop out of her stomach. Sick how? Leukemia. Early stages, but enough that taking his blood would likely kill him. And I'm not in the business of murdering sick humans for car crashes. She should have felt relief. Instead, she felt the walls closing in. Because if blood was off the table. Which brings us to option 2, Caden continued, and now his voice had gone soft and dangerous. The bride price. Chapter 3, the negotiation. Now, I know what you're thinking. Run. Scream. Call the police. Do literally anything except sit there and let this beautiful, terrifying man explain why you're about to become collateral for your brother's stupidity. But here's the thing about Mara that you need to understand. She'd been taking care of Jace their entire lives. When their parents died in a car crash when she was 16 and he was 18, she was the one who figured out how to pay the bills. When he dropped out of college, she worked 2 jobs to keep them afloat. When he got arrested for drunk and disorderly, she was the one who scraped together bail money. So when Caden Voss sat in her living room and explained that her brother owed a debt that could only be paid in blood or bride, Mara didn't run. She negotiated. What exactly does bride price mean? She asked, proud that her voice only shook a little. Caden tilted his head, studying her with those predator eyes. In traditional terms, you would join my pack as my mate, bear my children, submit to my authority in all things. His smile was sharp enough to cut glass. I can smell your thoughts, little chemist. You're already planning how to burn my house down. Heat flooded her cheeks. I'm not. You are. You smell like rebellion and terror in equal measure. He paused, nostrils flaring slightly. Interesting. And this is where the story takes its first strange turn. Because Caden took a deeper breath, really inhaling Mara's scent signature, and something remarkable happened. For the first time in 15 years, his wolf went quiet. Not calm, not relaxed. Quiet, like someone had suddenly turned off a radio that had been playing static at full volume for so long he'd forgotten what silence sounded like. What perfume are you wearing? The question came out sharper than he'd intended. Mara blinked, clearly thrown by the change in topic. I'm not. I don't wear perfume. It interferes with my work. Then what? He cut himself off, understanding flooding through him like ice water. You're not human. I am human. I just have good instincts. No. He stood, moving closer, and Mara's heart rate spiked so high he could hear it from across the room. You're something else. Something that makes calming sense. I make essential oils. It's not magic, it's just chemistry and... Prove it. Before she could ask what he meant, Caden was shifting. Not completely. That would have been impossible in her tiny living room. But enough. His eyes blazed gold, his canines elongated, and the air around him suddenly crackled with predatory energy that made every primitive instinct in Mara's brain scream. And then she did something that surprised them both. She stepped closer. Hey, she whispered, raising one hand slowly. Hey, it's okay. You're okay. The wolf in him tilted his head, suddenly fascinated. Her scent wrapped around him like a physical embrace, all vanilla and rain and something indefinably soothing. Something that said safe and home and rest in a language older than words. His wolf lay down. Later, Caden would tell her that in all his years as an alpha, he'd never experienced anything like it. His wolf had been in a constant state of alert since the night rogues killed his parents when he was 14. 15 years of hypervigilance, of sleeping 3 hours a night, of constant low-level aggression that made maintaining pack stability an exhausting daily battle. but one breath of Mara's natural scent signature, and his wolf had curled up like a puppy by a fireplace. "This changes the terms," he said quietly. "How?" "I'm not looking for a traditional mate. I'm looking for—" He seemed to struggle for words. "Medicine. Your medicine, Mara Lowe." Chapter 4, The Contract. What Caden proposed wasn't marriage. It was employment. Weird, intimate, slightly terrifying employment, but employment nonetheless. 6 months. 1 full lunar cycle. Live in his den, let him scent mark her every night to maintain the calming effect, and provide custom aromatherapy blends for the pack. In exchange, Jace's debt would be cleared and Mara would receive enough money to pay for her brother's cancer treatment. $500,000. "There will be rules," Caden said, pulling out an actual contract that looked like it had been drawn up by lawyers who specialized in supernatural law. Which, Mara was learning, was apparently a real thing. Rule 1. No romantic or sexual contact without explicit mutual consent. This is a business arrangement. Rule 2. You maintain your own living space within the den. Private bedroom, private bathroom, access to kitchen facilities. Rule 3. Scent marking occurs every evening at sunset. Non-negotiable. Missing more than 2 sessions per month voids the contract. Rule 4. You will attend pack functions as my companion, but are not required to submit to any pack member other than myself, and only in matters of safety. Rule 5. Either party may terminate the contract early with 7 days' notice, but Jace's debt remains in effect until the full 6 months are completed by someone. Mara read through the contract twice. It was surprisingly fair, considering she was essentially agreeing to be a live-in emotional support human for a werewolf pack. "What exactly does scent marking involve?" she asked. A flush actually colored his cheeks. "I nuzzle your neck and wrists. Maybe your hair. It's intimate but not sexual. Think of it as very aggressive cuddling. And this works. This keeps your wolf calm. For about 24 hours, yes." She looked at the contract again. At the dollar amount that would save her brother's life. At the man who was offering her a way out of a situation that shouldn't have been her responsibility in the first place. "Where do I sign?" Chapter 5. Welcome to the Den. If you've never seen a werewolf pack's den, imagine the most expensive mountain lodge you can think of. Now add security systems that could protect Fort Knox, a kitchen designed to feed 30 people, and enough weapons mounted on the walls to supply a small army. Also, everything smells like pine, musk, and barely contain violence. Caden's pack compound sat on 200 acres of private forest land about an hour outside the city. The main house was all exposed timber and floor-to-ceiling windows, the kind of place that probably cost more than most people made in a lifetime. But it was the sounds that got to Mara first. Laughter echoing from the kitchen. Someone playing guitar on the back deck. The soft sounds of a dozen conversations happening at once. It sounded like family. "How many people live here?" she asked as Caden led her through the front door. 15 core pack members, plus visiting family. "Don't worry, you won't be expected to memorize everyone immediately." That was a relief, because the faces looking up as they entered were varied enough to make Mara's head spin. Young and old, every ethnicity imaginable, but all with the same underlying intensity that marked them as predators. And all of them were staring at her with expressions ranging from curiosity to outright suspicion. "Everyone," Caden's voice carried easily through the room. "This is Mara. She'll be staying with us for the next 6 months." A woman who looked like she could bench press a car stepped forward. She was gorgeous in the way that made other women consider taking up permanent residence under a rock, with the kind of confidence that suggested she'd never doubted herself a day in her life. "I'm Elena, the pack's second. Welcome." Her handshake was firm enough to crush bones, but her smile seemed genuine. "Don't let the testosterone festival intimidate you. Most of them are actually house-trained." "Most?" Mara asked weakly. "Well, Marcus still hasn't learned to put the toilet seat down, but we're working on it." A younger man, Marcus, presumably, flipped Elena off from across the room, which got him a thrown couch cushion to the head and a round of laughter from everyone else. "Your room is upstairs," Caden said. "Second door on the left. Why don't you get settled, and we'll do the first scent marking session after dinner." Mara's room was not what she'd expected. She'd been picturing something like a guest room, maybe a futon and a mini-fridge. Instead, she walked into what could only be described as a luxury suite. King-size bed with enough pillows to stock a hotel. Sitting area with a gas fireplace. Bathroom with a tub big enough to swim in. and covering every available surface, dozens and dozens of plants. Real plants. Healthy plants. Someone had turned her room into a garden. There was a note on the bedside table, written in Caden's precise handwriting. I thought you might be more comfortable with familiar scents. The jasmine by the window blooms at night. I'm told it's particularly good for anxiety. See, Mara sat on the edge of the bed and, for the first time since this whole mess started, felt like crying. Not from fear or overwhelm, but from the simple kindness of someone paying attention to what might make her feel at home. She was so screwed. Chapter 6, First Night Protocols. Dinner with a werewolf pack was like nothing Mara had ever experienced. First, there was the sheer amount of food. She'd thought college boys could eat, but watching 15 werewolves go through what appeared to be an entire grocery store's worth of groceries was genuinely awe-inspiring. Second, there was the volume. Werewolf conversations didn't happen at normal human levels. Everything was louder, faster, more intense. But there was also something beautiful about it. The way Elena made sure the youngest pack member, a girl who couldn't be more than 19, got first choice of the good bread rolls. How Marcus automatically cut up the meat for an older man whose hands shook with arthritis. The way everyone made space for each other, literally and figuratively. It felt like family, the kind Mara had only seen in movies. So, said a woman named Claire, who'd been introduced as the pack's historian. What's your story? How does a human perfume maker end up as our alphas? Consultant. Caden supplied smoothly when Claire trailed off. Right. Consultant. Mara caught the look that passed between several pack members and realized that whatever Caden had told them about their arrangement, it wasn't the whole truth. Which was fair, she supposed. My brother made some poor choices, was probably the diplomatic version. I make custom aromatherapy blends, she said instead. Essential oils that help with anxiety, insomnia, that sort of thing. Apparently, I'm good at it. Good enough to calm our boy down there? Asked an older man named Robert. Because I've been in this pack for 20 years, and I've never seen Caden sit through an entire meal without getting up to check the perimeter at least twice. Mara glanced at Caden, who was indeed sitting relaxed in his chair, looking more human than wolf for the first time since she'd met him. Still testing that theory, she said carefully. After dinner, Caden walked her back upstairs. The house had settled into evening routines. She could hear someone washing dishes in the kitchen, a TV playing in one of the common rooms, the soft murmur of conversations winding down. Are you nervous? He asked as they stood outside her bedroom door. Terrified, she admitted. I've never done anything like this before. Neither have I. His smile was softer than any expression she'd seen from him so far. We'll figure it out as we go. The first scent marking session was awkward in the way that most intimate things are when they happen between strangers. Caden sat on the edge of her bed, the only seating in the room besides a chair by the window, and Mara perched next to him, trying not to think about how this looked. Just try to relax, he said, which was possibly the least helpful advice in the history of advice. Right. Relaxing. With a werewolf about to nuzzle my neck. Totally normal Tuesday evening activity. That got a genuine laugh out of him. When you put it like that, it does sound ridiculous. It is ridiculous. This whole situation is ridiculous. She turned to face him more fully. But my brother is dying, and you need sleep, and sometimes ridiculous is what we've got to work with. Sometimes ridiculous is all we've got, he agreed. The first time he leaned in, Mara tensed so hard she nearly gave herself whiplash. His nose brushed against the curve of her neck, and she felt his inhale like a physical touch. Better? She asked after a moment. Much. His voice was already different, deeper, more relaxed. Again, by the third pass, she'd stopped jumping when he moved. By the fifth, she was starting to understand why this worked. There was something almost meditative about it, the careful way he breathed her in, the gentleness of his touch against her wrists. When he finally pulled back, his eyes were already heavy with approaching sleep. Thank you, he said quietly. Thank you for the plants. He smiled. Sleep well, Mara. She did sleep well, better than she had in months. What she didn't know was that Caden slept through the night for the first time in 15 years, curled up on the couch in the living room below her bedroom, breathing in the faint traces of her scent that drifted down through the floorboards. Chapter 7, Pack Dynamics. The next few weeks developed a rhythm that surprised Mara with how quickly it felt normal. Mornings were hers. She'd wake early, before most of the pack stirred, and work in the kitchen on her various projects. Her client base had actually grown since moving to the compound. Apparently, word had gotten out in the supernatural community that she was taking on new cases, and her schedule was booked solid. Afternoons were for pack integration. Elena took it upon herself to teach Mara the social dynamics of werewolf politics, which was like getting a crash course in diplomacy, psychology, and barely controlled chaos all at once. The key thing to understand, Elena explained as they sat on the back deck watching some of the younger pack members play what appeared to be a cross between soccer and wrestling, is that werewolf society is built on scent, territory, and hierarchy. In that order. Scent I'm starting to understand. Territory seems obvious. But hierarchy? It's not what humans think. It's not about who can beat who in a fight. It's about who can be trusted to make decisions when everything goes to hell. Elena pointed to where Marcus was mediating some kind of dispute between two teenagers. Marcus isn't our second because he's the second strongest fighter. He's our second because when shit gets weird, he's the one everyone trusts to keep his head. And Caden is Alpha because when the rogues killed his parents, he was 15 years old and he held this pack together through sheer force of will. He made sure everyone was fed, housed, and safe while he was still figuring out how to shave. Elena's expression grew serious. But Alpha is a hard job, Mara, especially for someone who never gets to rest. The conversation was interrupted by a commotion from the yard. One of the teenagers, a girl with bright purple hair who'd been introduced as Sam, had apparently said something that set off the boy she'd been arguing with. His eyes were starting to glow, and his posture was shifting into something more predatory. "Shit," Elena muttered, starting to get up. But before she could intervene, Mara was already moving. She didn't think about it, didn't plan it. She just walked over to where the situation was escalating and stepped between the two kids. "Hey," she said softly, the same tone she'd used with Caden that first night. "Hey, it's okay." The boy's head snapped toward her, and for a moment Mara thought she'd made a serious mistake. His wolf was much closer to the surface than she'd realized, and territorial disputes weren't exactly her area of expertise. But then her scent hit him, and something remarkable happened. The tension drained out of his shoulders, his eyes faded back to human brown, and he actually took a step back. "Sorry, Sam," he muttered, not meeting anyone's eyes. "I didn't mean to, sorry." Sam stared at Mara like she'd just performed magic. Which, in a way, she had. The story of Mara's intervention spread through the pack like wildfire. By dinner, she was fielding requests for custom blends from half the pack members, and more than one person made comments about how much calmer the house felt overall. But it was Caden's reaction that really caught her attention. "You stepped between two shifting wolves today," he said that evening as they settled into their now familiar routine. "They weren't shifting. Not really. Close enough." He was quiet for a moment. "Most humans would have run." "I'm not most humans, apparently." "No," he agreed, leaning in to nuzzle the curve of her neck. "You're definitely not." This time, when he breathed her in, Mara felt something shift. Not just in him, but in her. The careful distance she'd been maintaining, the professional boundaries she'd drawn around their arrangement, they were starting to blur. And the scariest part? She wasn't sure she minded. Chapter 8, The Challenge. 3 weeks into her residency at the compound, Mara got her first real taste of werewolf politics. It started with a phone call. Caden was in his office, a room that looked like it belonged to a Fortune 500 CEO rather than a supernatural alpha, when his phone rang. Mara was curled up in the chair across from his desk, working on a custom blend for a vampire client, so she heard his side of the conversation. "What do you mean challenge?" His voice went from relaxed to alpha dangerous in the space between one word and the next. A pause. "When?" Another pause, longer this time. "Fine. But if this is some political bullshit, Catherine, I'm going to be very unhappy with the Seattle pack." He hung up and sat back in his chair, running a hand through his hair. "Problem?" Mara asked. "Maybe. There's another alpha coming to visit next week. Catherine Brennan from the Seattle pack. She's ambitious." "Ambitious how?" "The kind of ambitious that looks at territory maps and sees opportunities for expansion." He looked at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "She's going to want to meet you." Catherine Brennan arrived on a Thursday with an entourage that screamed power and money. 3 SUVs, 6 pack members, and enough designer luggage to stock a boutique. She was beautiful in the way that made other people feel like they needed to apologize for existing. Tall, blonde, with the kind of bone structure that belonged on magazine covers. She was also, Mara realized within 5 minutes of meeting her, absolutely ruthless. "So you're the famous chemist," Catherine said, extending a hand that was perfectly manicured and just a little too cold. "I've heard such interesting things about you." "Have you?" "Oh yes. A human who can calm werewolves with just her scent? It's quite the party trick." The insult was delivered with a smile bright enough to power a small city, but it was still an insult. Around them, Mara could feel the pack's energy shifting, tension rising like a tide. "It's not a trick," Caden said quietly. "It's a gift." "Of course it is." Catherine's smile never wavered. "I was wondering if we might have a demonstration? I'd love to see how this arrangement works." What Catherine was asking for was a challenge. Not an official one. That would have involved lawyers and formal declarations, and probably someone ending up dead. But a challenge nonetheless. She wanted to see if Mara could handle a truly dominant wolf, or if her abilities only worked on Caden because of some personal connection. What she didn't realize was that she'd just made a serious tactical error. Because while Mara might have been human, she'd been living with 15 werewolves for 3 weeks. She'd learned to read pack dynamics, to understand the subtle interplay of dominance and submission that governed every interaction. And she'd just watched someone insult not just her, but Caden and his pack's judgment. So when Catherine let just a hint of her wolf energy leak out, not enough to be threatening, just enough to make a point, Mara didn't step back. She stepped forward. "You know," she said conversationally, "I've been working with essential oils for years, and I've learned that the most effective blends are always the ones tailored to individual needs." She pulled a small vial from her pocket, one of her standard calming blends, nothing special. "This one, for instance, is designed for wolves who have trouble with impulse control." She uncapped the vial, and immediately the air filled with the scent of lavender, chamomile, and something deeper. Something that spoke directly to the wolf brain and said, in no uncertain terms, "Settle down." Catherine's carefully controlled expression flickered for just a moment. Her wolf, which had been pressing against her human form like a caged animal, suddenly decided that maybe being aggressive wasn't such a good idea after all. "Impressive," she said after a moment. "Very impressive." But Mara wasn't done. "The interesting thing about scent-based therapy," she continued, "is that it works best on wolves who are secure enough in their own power to accept help. Insecure wolves tend to fight it, because they're afraid that needing support makes them weak." Another pause. "This one longer." "I see," Catherine said finally. "Well, thank you for the demonstration." The rest of Catherine's visit passed without incident, but something had changed. Word spread through the supernatural community that the human living with Caden's pack wasn't just some helpless girl paying off her brother's debt. She was someone who could hold her own against visiting alphas without breaking a sweat. More importantly, Caden had watched the whole thing with an expression of pride that made Mara's chest do funny things. "That was well done," he said that evening as they settled into their routine. "She was testing me." "She was. And you passed." He paused, his nose brushing against her pulse point. "You smell different when you're confident. Like winter air and determination." "Is that good?" "It's perfect." Chapter 9, Full Moon Rising. If you've never experienced a werewolf pack during full moon week, imagine 15 people going through the world's most intense case of PMS simultaneously. Everything is louder, brighter, more intense. Emotions run higher, tempers run shorter, and everyone's supernatural abilities are cranked up to 11. For Mara, it was like being a tuning fork in a rock concert. "Is it always like this?" she asked Elena on Tuesday, after watching 2 pack members get into a screaming match over who had used the last of the coffee. "Pretty much. The 3 days leading up to the full moon are always chaos. Day of is actually better. Everyone shifts and runs it off. But the lead up?" Elena rubbed her temples. "Hence why we usually go to the pack house upstate for moon runs. Fewer neighbors to accidentally terrify. The pack house was, well, calling it rustic would be generous. It was essentially a hunting lodge that had been winterized and expanded to accommodate a large group, located on 1,000 acres of private forest land that the pack had owned for generations. No neighbors for miles, no noise ordinances, no need to worry about anyone calling in noise complaints when 15 werewolves decided to have a howling contest at 3 a.m. "You don't have to come," Caden told her as they loaded the SUVs Wednesday afternoon. "Full moons can be intense for humans. I'm contractually obligated to provide you with nightly scent marking sessions," she reminded him. "Besides, I'm curious." What she didn't mention was that she was also terrified. 3 weeks of living with the pack had taught her a lot about werewolf culture. but she'd never actually seen anyone shift. The closest she'd come was that incident with the teenagers, and even that had been more about preventing a shift than witnessing one. The pack house was exactly what she'd expected. All wood paneling and stone fireplaces, with furniture that looked like it had been built to survive apocalyptic use. But there was something else, too. An energy that thrummed through the walls, like the building itself was alive. "The land here is sacred to our kind," Caden explained as he showed her to a bedroom on the second floor. "It's been a gathering place for werewolf packs for over 2 centuries. You might feel more here." More turned out to be an understatement. The first thing Mara noticed was that her abilities were stronger here. Scents she could usually only detect at close range were now obvious from across the room. The emotional signatures of the pack members were so vivid they were almost visible, like colored auras hanging in the air around each person. The second thing she noticed was that her own scent was changing. Not dramatically, but enough that she caught Caden doing double takes when he thought she wasn't looking. "What is it?" she asked him Thursday evening as they prepared for what would be her first full moon experience. "You smell like pack," he said simply. "Like you belong here." Before she could ask what that meant, the first howl split the night air. There's no way to adequately describe the sound of a werewolf pack beginning their moon run. It starts with one voice, usually the alpha, rising in a call that seems to come from the very center of the earth. Then others join in, harmonizing in ways that human vocal cords could never manage, until the entire night is filled with a symphony that speaks to something primal and ancient in the human soul. Mara felt it in her bones, that call. Felt it in her blood and her breath and the rapid beating of her heart. Every human instinct she possessed was screaming at her to run, to hide, to get as far away as possible from the predators who were about to shed their human masks entirely. Instead, she walked out onto the back deck and watched them shift. If you've never seen a werewolf transformation, you might imagine it's like the movies. All Hollywood special effects and dramatic music. The reality is both more beautiful and more terrifying than any CGI could capture. Caden went first, as was his right as alpha. One moment he was standing on the deck beside her, human and familiar. The next, his form was flowing like water, bones reshaping, muscles redistributing, until where a man had stood, there was now a wolf the size of a small horse. But not just any wolf. His coat was the color of midnight, so dark it seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. His eyes remained the same amber gold, but now they glowed with an inner fire that marked him as something far more than animal. When he looked at her, Mara felt seen in a way that was almost overwhelming. One by one, the rest of the pack followed suit. Elena became a silver-gray wolf with white markings around her eyes. Marcus shifted into a red-brown coat that matched his human hair. The younger pack members were smaller, lighter, but no less magnificent. And then they ran. Watching a werewolf pack on a moon run is like watching poetry in motion. They moved as one organism, flowing through the forest with a grace and coordination that took Mara's breath away. She could hear them in the distance, not just howls now, but the sounds of pure joy. Barks of laughter, playful growls, the rustle of bodies moving through undergrowth at speeds no human could match. She was so caught up in listening that she almost missed the soft sound behind her. A whine, quiet and questioning. She turned to find Caden's wolf standing at the edge of the deck, head tilted in what could only be described as an invitation. "You want me to come with you?" she asked softly. The wolf chuffed, a sound somewhere between a laugh and agreement, and took a few steps toward the forest before looking back at her expectantly. Common sense said this was a terrible idea. Humans didn't go on werewolf pack runs. Humans stayed safely inside while the wolves did their wolf things. Humans definitely didn't follow a shifted alpha into a dark forest in the middle of the night. But Mara had stopped making sensible decisions the night she signed a contract to be a werewolf's emotional support human. She followed him into the woods. Chapter 10, The Moon Run. Running through a moonlit forest with a pack of werewolves was nothing like Mara had expected. For one thing, they slowed down for her. Not dramatically, she still had to push herself to keep up, but enough that she could follow the silver thread of the path they were taking through the trees. For another, she wasn't alone. There was always at least one wolf within sight, usually Caden, but sometimes Elena or Marcus, making sure she didn't get lost or hurt. But the most surprising thing was how right it felt. The forest at night was alive in a way she'd never experienced. Every sound was sharper, every scent more vivid. The moonlight turned everything silver and shadow, creating a world that felt magical rather than frightening. And the wolves were magnificent. They played as they ran, pouncing on each other, racing ahead only to circle back, engaging in what appeared to be elaborate games of tag that spanned acres of forest. When they came to a clearing near a stream, several of them shifted briefly back to human form, laughing and talking before shifting again and continuing the run. "This is incredible," Mara called out during one of these brief human moments, her voice breathless from the effort of keeping up. Elena, currently in human form and apparently not even winded, grinned at her. "You're doing great for a human. Most people would have given up miles ago." "Most people are smarter than me," Mara replied, which got a laugh from several pack members. That's when she noticed Marcus looking at her with an odd expression. "What?" she asked. "You smell different," he said. "Stronger." "Like?" He paused, nostrils flaring. "Like you're changing." Before Mara could ask what he meant, Caden appeared at her side in human form, naked and completely unself-conscious about it. "We should head back," he said. "You've been running for 3 hours." 3 hours? It felt like they'd just started. Mara looked up at the position of the moon and realized he was right. Somehow, she'd spent half the night running through the forest with a pack of werewolves and hadn't even noticed the time passing. "I'm not tired," she said, and realized with surprise that it was true. She should have been exhausted. Should have been stumbling over roots and begging to rest. Instead, she felt energized, alive in a way she'd never experienced. Caden's eyes narrowed slightly. "Marcus is right. You do smell different." "Different how?" Instead of answering, he shifted back to wolf form and approached her slowly. His nose brushed against her wrist, then her neck, then he froze. When he shifted back to human form, his expression was a mixture of wonder and something that might have been fear. "We need to get back to the house," he said. Now, the pack house felt different when they returned. Smaller somehow, as if the walls couldn't quite contain the energy that had been building all night. The pack members were settling down into post-run routines, raiding the kitchen, claiming spots by the fireplace, generally behaving like a group of people coming down from the world's best natural high. But Caden pulled Mara aside, up to her room, where he proceeded to pace like a caged animal. "We have a problem," he said finally. "What kind of problem?" "The kind where you're not entirely human anymore." The words hit her like a physical blow. "What do you mean?" "I mean your scent signature has changed. Not just a little, dramatically. You smell like pack now." "Like?" He stopped pacing and looked at her with an expression she couldn't read. "Like you're becoming one of us." "That's impossible." "Apparently not." He ran a hand through his hair. "There are stories, old legends, about humans who spend enough time with werewolf packs that they begin to change. Not shifting. That's genetic. You're born with it or you're not. But other things. Enhanced senses, longer lifespan, stronger connection to lunar cycles." Mara sat down heavily on the edge of the bed. "Is that what's happening to me?" "I don't know. Maybe. The scent change is definitely real." He sat down beside her. "How do you feel?" Now that he mentioned it, she did feel different. More aware, like someone had adjusted the contrast on the world around her. She could hear conversations happening downstairs with perfect clarity. Could smell the individual scent signatures of pack members 3 rooms away. "Stronger," she said quietly. "More connected. To the pack." She met his eyes. "To you." ##### Chapter 11. The Bond Awakens, 75:00, 83:00. Narrator * that night, for the first time since their arrangement began, Caden couldn't sleep. It wasn't the old insomnia that had been cured weeks ago by Mara's presence. This was something else entirely. A restless energy that had nothing to do with his wolf and everything to do with the woman sleeping in the room above him. Because that's what she was doing, sleeping. Peacefully, deeply, for the first time since arriving at the pack house. Her scent had settled into something rich and complex, layered with notes that spoke of pack and belonging and home. And underneath it all, something that made his wolf pace anxiously behind his ribs. "Mine." The thought came unbidden, instinctive, and absolutely terrifying. Mara's dreams that night were vivid and strange. She dreamed of running through forests that seemed to go on forever, of hunting prey that always stayed just out of reach, of a silver thread that connected her to something warm and safe and utterly essential. She woke to find Caden sitting in the chair by her window, still dressed in the clothes he'd thrown on after the run, watching her with an expression that made her heart skip. "How long have you been there?" she asked. "A few hours." His voice was rough, like he hadn't been sleeping either. "You were dreaming." "How do you know?" "You were making sounds. Little whimpers and huffs. Like," he paused, "like a wolf pup dreaming of its first hunt." Mara sat up, suddenly fully awake. "Caden, what's happening to me?" Instead of answering immediately, he stood and moved to sit on the edge of her bed. Close enough that she could smell his scent, pine and musk, and something uniquely him that made her want to lean closer. "I think," he said slowly, "that our arrangement has become something neither of us planned for." "What do you mean?" He reached out, slowly enough that she could pull away if she wanted, and touched her cheek. His thumb brushed across her skin, and Mara felt that touch like electricity straight to her core. "I mean that somewhere in the last month, this stopped being about your brother's debt and started being about us." The admission hung in the air between them like a challenge, because they both knew that crossing that line changed everything. Their careful professional boundaries, their neat contract with its explicit rules about consent and romance. All of it became meaningless the moment they acknowledged what had been building between them. "The contract says no romantic contact without mutual consent," Mara said softly. "It does. Are you asking for my consent?" His hand was still on her cheek, his thumb now tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that made her breath catch. "I'm asking what you want, Mara. Not what the contract says, not what your brother needs, not what the pack expects. What do you want?" It should have been a simple question. A month ago, it would have been a simple question. But a month ago, she hadn't been living with a werewolf pack. A month ago, she hadn't spent 3 weeks watching this man struggle to hold together 15 different personalities while never asking for help himself. A month ago, she hadn't felt the way his wolf settled when she touched him, hadn't experienced the fierce protectiveness that rose in her chest whenever someone threatened him. A month ago, she hadn't been falling in love. "I want," she said carefully, "to renegotiate our contract." That got a smile out of him. The first real smile she'd seen since they'd returned from the forest. "What terms did you have in mind?" Instead of answering with words, she leaned forward and kissed him. If their first kiss had been hesitant, exploratory, this one was desperate. A month of careful distance and professional boundaries, and pretending they didn't both lie awake at night thinking about what it would feel like to cross that line. All of it dissolved the moment their lips met. Caden's hand slid into her hair, tilting her head to deepen the kiss, and Mara felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. Like a lock tumbling open, like a missing piece sliding into place. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, she realized she could smell his emotions as clearly as her own. Want and need and something deeper, something that tasted like forever. "New contract terms," she said against his lips. "I want to stay, not just for 6 months, not just to pay off Jace's debt. I want to stay because this is where I belong. With the pack." She pulled back just far enough to meet his eyes. "With you." What happened next was inevitable, really. All the careful control they'd both maintained, all the professional distance, all the practical reasons why this was a terrible idea. None of it mattered anymore. Because somewhere between the first night he'd nuzzled her neck and this moment, breathing hard in a moonlit bedroom, they'd stopped being alpha and contractor and become something else entirely. They'd become mates. Chapter 12, The Claiming. Now, I should probably mention that werewolf mating isn't exactly like human romance. It's more intense, more permanent, and it involves a level of emotional and psychic connection that most humans aren't prepared for. But Mara, as we've established, wasn't most humans. The first thing she noticed when Caden's lips found the sensitive spot where her neck met her shoulder was that her senses sharpened even further. She could hear the heartbeats of pack members 3 floors below, could smell the approach of dawn still hours away, could feel Caden's wolf pressing against the surface of his human form, wanting to claim and mark and make absolutely certain that everyone knew she belonged to him. The second thing she noticed was that she wanted that too. "Are you sure?" he whispered against her skin, and she could hear the effort it cost him to ask. To give her one more chance to change her mind before they crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life," she said, and realized it was true. The claiming bite, when it came, was nothing like she'd expected. There was no pain, no sense of being overpowered or dominated. Instead, there was a moment of perfect clarity, like suddenly being able to see colors that had always existed but never had names. And then the bond snapped into place. Imagine, if you will, spending your entire life in a room and not realizing there was a window. Then someone opens the curtains. and suddenly you can see a whole world you never knew existed. That's what the mate bond felt like discovering a part of herself she'd never known was missing. She could feel Caden's emotions as if they were her own. His wonder at the strength of the connection, his fierce protectiveness, his overwhelming love that had been building for weeks but only now had permission to exist. And underneath it all, his wolf's deep satisfaction. Mine, it seemed to purr. Finally mine. But the bond ran both ways. Caden gasped as Mara's feelings flooded through him. Her determination, her loyalty, her quiet strength that had been holding her together through everything life had thrown at her. And her love, powerful and sure and absolutely unafraid of the monster he sometimes thought he was. When the initial rush of connection settled, they lay tangled together in the pre-dawn darkness, breathing hard and staring at each other with something approaching awe. So, Mara said finally, "I guess that makes the contract null and void." "Completely," Caden agreed. "Mates don't have contracts. They have forever." What they didn't know, as they lay there discovering what it felt like to be two halves of the same soul, was that the rest of the pack had felt the exact moment the bond formed. Elena would later describe it as like watching lightning strike in slow motion. And Marcus said it felt like the entire house had suddenly settled into its foundation more securely. Down in the kitchen, where she'd been raiding the refrigerator post-run, Sam looked up at the ceiling with a grin. "About time," she muttered, and went back to making what appeared to be a sandwich large enough to feed a small army. Because werewolf packs always know when their alpha finds his mate. It's written in the air, in the subtle shift of power dynamics, in the way the very walls of the den seemed to approve. And this pack had been waiting for their alpha to find happiness for a very long time. Chapter 13, New Pack Dynamics. If you think waking up as a newly mated werewolf couple is all romance and breakfast in bed, you clearly haven't spent much time around werewolf packs. Mara's first clue that their situation had become significantly more complicated came at approximately 6:30 a.m., when someone started pounding on her bedroom door like the house was on fire. "Alpha!" Marcus's voice carried through the wood with barely contained panic. "We have a problem." Caden was up and moving before Mara had even finished processing the words, pulling on clothes with the kind of efficiency that spoke of years of middle-of-the-night emergencies. "What is it?" he called out, not bothering to open the door. "Catherine Brennan is here, with half the Seattle pack, and they're asking about territorial disputes and mate bonds, and something about challenging the legitimacy of human pack integration." Mara felt Caden's emotions spike through their new bond, anger, protectiveness, and under it all, a cold calculation that reminded her that he hadn't become alpha by being nice. "How many?" he asked. 12 wolves. All dominant. And Catherine brought lawyers. Nothing quite prepares you for werewolf politics at dawn after the best night of your life. Within 20 minutes, Mara found herself sitting in the pack house's main room, wearing clothes she'd thrown on in the dark and trying to look like she hadn't just been claimed by an alpha werewolf. Across from her, Catherine Brennan sat with the kind of perfect composure that suggested she'd been planning this conversation for weeks. "I hope you understand," Catherine was saying, her tone perfectly reasonable and absolutely poisonous, "that this presents certain complications." "What complications?" Caden's voice was level, but Mara could feel his wolf pacing through their bond. "Well, there's the matter of territorial inheritance, for one. If your mate produces heirs, those children would have claims to both your territory and any territory she might be entitled to through her bloodline. Mara is human," Elena pointed out from her position by the fireplace, where she was doing a very good impression of someone casually lounging while actually being ready to spring into action at any moment. "Humans don't have territorial claims." "Don't they?" Catherine smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made Mara want to check her pockets to make sure nothing had been stolen. "I've done some research into Miss Lowe's family history. Very interesting findings. This, as it turned out, was where the story took another unexpected turn, because Catherine's research had uncovered something that Mara herself had never known. Her grandmother, the sweet old lady who'd taught her about herbs and essential oils, who'd always seemed to know exactly what blend would help with any problem, hadn't been entirely human. "Wolf-touched," Catherine explained with obvious satisfaction. "Third generation. Her great-grandmother was the human mate of a Norwegian alpha who died in the territorial wars of the 1800s. The bloodline carries certain privileges." Mara felt like the ground was shifting under her feet. "What kind of privileges?" "Territorial claims through matrilineal descent, pack protection rights, and most relevantly, the legal standing to challenge pack leadership if she believes her mate is unfit to rule. The silence that followed this revelation was the kind that pressed against your eardrums like an approaching storm. "Are you suggesting," Caden said quietly, "that my mate might challenge my authority?" "I'm suggesting," Catherine replied smoothly, "that the supernatural community is watching this situation very carefully. A human, even a wolf-touched human, with this much influence over an alpha's pack raises questions about the stability of territorial boundaries." What Catherine was really saying, underneath all the legal terminology and political niceties, was that other packs were nervous. An alpha who could be calmed and controlled by his human mate was an alpha who might make decisions based on human sensibilities rather than wolf logic. And in a world where territory was everything and pack boundaries were maintained through strength and fear, that was a problem. But Catherine had made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that Mara was just along for the ride, a passive participant in werewolf politics who could be intimidated by legal threats and veiled challenges. She'd clearly never met a woman who'd spent years managing her brother's messes while building a business and maintaining her sanity through pure, stubborn determination. "You know what I think?" Mara said, standing up with the kind of calm that made several of Catherine's pack members shift nervously. "I think you came here hoping to find a weakness you could exploit. A human mate who didn't understand pack law, or an alpha who'd choose his personal happiness over his pack's stability." She walked over to where Catherine sat, moving with a grace that hadn't been there a month ago, and smiled. "But here's what you found instead. A pack that's stronger and more stable than it's been in years. An alpha who sleeps through the night for the first time since he was 14. And a mate who's spent the last month learning everything she could about werewolf culture because she actually gives a damn about getting it right." Mara leaned down, bringing herself to Catherine's eye level. "So here's my counterproposal. You and your pack can leave. Now, and in return, I won't demonstrate exactly how much influence I have over werewolf behavior by turning your entire delegation into a pack of sleepy puppies who just want to go home and take a nap." The threat was delivered with such perfect politeness that it took a moment for everyone to realize what she'd just said. Mara was threatening to essentially drug an entire pack of dominant werewolves into submission using nothing but aromatherapy. The scary part? Everyone in the room knew she could probably do it. Catherine's smile finally slipped. "That would be considered an act of war." "No," Caden said, standing to move beside his mate. "That would be considered pest control." Chapter 14. Consequences and Revelations. Catherine and her pack left within the hour, but not before making it very clear that this wasn't over. Territorial disputes in the werewolf world had a way of escalating, and Mara had just painted a target on both herself and Caden's pack. "So," Elena said once the SUVs had disappeared down the mountain road, "that was fun. Anyone want to tell me how we went from peaceful mate bond celebration to potential pack war in the span of one morning?" "Politics," Caden said grimly. "Catherine's been looking for an excuse to challenge our territorial boundaries for months." Mara just gave her the perfect opening. "I'm sorry," Mara began, but he cut her off. "Don't. You handled that perfectly. Better than perfectly, actually. But we need to be prepared for what comes next." What came next, as it turned out, was a crash course in supernatural law that made Mara's head spin. Werewolf territorial law, Claire explained as she spread ancient texts across the dining table, was based on a combination of historical precedent, pack strength, and bloodline inheritance. Most disputes were settled through formal challenges, essentially sanctioned fights between alphas or treaty negotiations that could take years to resolve. But Mara's situation introduced complications that hadn't been seen in generations. The last recorded case of a wolf-touched human claiming territorial rights was in 1847, Claire said, pointing to a passage written in what appeared to be Old Norse. A woman named Astrid Eriksdotter challenged the dissolution of her mate's pack after he died in battle. She won, and maintained control of the territory for 37 years. How did she win? Mara asked. She challenged every alpha who tried to claim her land to single combat, and she won every fight. Claire looked up from the book with an expression of academic fascination. Apparently, wolf-touched humans are significantly stronger than regular humans. Enhanced healing, improved reflexes, resistance to supernatural intimidation. Wait, Mara interrupted. Are you saying I'm going to have to fight Catherine? Not necessarily. Territorial challenges can take several forms. Combat is traditional, but there are alternatives. Elena looked up from the legal document she'd been studying. Pack stability trials, economic challenges, leadership competency evaluations. She paused. Mating contests. Mating contests? Mara's voice cracked slightly on the words. Whoever produces an heir first wins, Elena explained apologetically. It's archaic, but it's legal. Narrator asterisk the conversation continued for hours, diving deep into legal precedents and historical cases that made Mara feel like she'd accidentally enrolled in the world's most stressful law school. But gradually, a picture emerged. Catherine wasn't just challenging their right to territory. She was challenging the fundamental idea that human-werewolf bonds could create stable pack leadership. If she could prove that Caden was compromised by his attachment to a human mate, she could argue that his pack was vulnerable and therefore his territory was up for grabs. So what do we do? Mara asked finally. We prove her wrong, Caden said simply. We show the supernatural community that our pack is stronger because of our bond, not weaker. And how exactly do we do that? Caden's smile was sharp enough to cut glass. We host the Autumn Gathering. The Autumn Gathering, Marcus explained, was essentially a supernatural convention. Representatives from every major pack on the West Coast, plus delegates from vampire covens, fae courts, and other supernatural communities, all coming together for 3 days of politics, networking, and barely contained territorial posturing. It was also the perfect opportunity to demonstrate pack stability and leadership competence in front of everyone who mattered in the supernatural world. It's risky, Elena warned. If anything goes wrong, if there are any signs of instability or conflict, it'll confirm every suspicion Catherine has been spreading. And if we don't host it, Caden pointed out, it looks like we're afraid to submit to community judgment, which is almost as bad. Mara looked around the table at the faces of the pack members who had become her family over the past month. People who were willing to put themselves at risk because she'd fallen in love with their alpha and created a political mess in the process. When is the gathering? She asked. 2 weeks, Claire said. Full moon weekend. We'd be hosting nearly 100 supernatural delegates on our territory during the time when everyone's powers are at their peak. Perfect, Mara said, ignoring the way her stomach dropped at the thought. Let's throw a party. Chapter 15, Preparation for War. Planning a supernatural political gathering in 2 weeks was like organizing a wedding, a business conference, and a medieval tournament simultaneously, with the added challenge that half your guests could literally tear each other's throats out if things went poorly. Mara threw herself into the preparations with the kind of focused intensity that she usually reserved for her most challenging custom blends. If they were going to host the supernatural community's most important annual event, they were going to do it right. Accommodation for 12 vampire delegates who can't be exposed to sunlight, 37 werewolves from 6 different packs who may or may not get along, 14 fae representatives who have dietary restrictions that change based on the phase of the moon, and a partridge in a pear tree, Elena muttered, staring at her ever-growing lists. This is insane. Sanity is overrated, Mara replied, not looking up from her own notes. She was working on scent management, creating custom aromatherapy blends for each group that would help prevent the kind of supernatural testosterone poisoning that could turn a diplomatic gathering into a bloodbath. Vampires need something calming but not sleep-inducing, she said, thinking out loud. Werewolves need aggression management without affecting their alert responses. Fae are tricky. They're sensitive to iron-based compounds, but they respond well to earth scents. You do realize, Marcus said from where he was coordinating security arrangements, that you're essentially planning to drug the entire supernatural community into behaving themselves? I prefer to think of it as providing a relaxing atmospheric enhancement, Mara said with a grin. Besides, it's not drugging if it's aromatherapy. But scent management was just one piece of an incredibly complex puzzle. There were also territorial protocols to navigate, which pack representatives could be housed near each other without starting fights, how to arrange seating for formal dinners so that ancient rivalries didn't explode into violence, which delegates needed special dietary accommodations or security arrangements. And then there were the challenges themselves. For one thing, she'd spent the last month becoming genuinely integrated into pack life. She wasn't just Caden's human mate tagging along for the ride. She was someone the pack members had come to trust and rely on. When Sam had nightmares about her first shift, she came to Mara for the calming blend that would help her sleep. When Robert's arthritis flared up during cold snaps, he asked Mara to adjust his pain management oils. When Elena was stressed about pack finances, She and Mara would sit up late working through budget projections and territory management strategies. She'd become essential to the pack's daily functioning in ways that went far beyond her original role as Caden's sleep aide. More importantly, her abilities were continuing to evolve. The wolf-touched bloodline that Catherine had uncovered wasn't just a legal technicality. It was apparently an active part of Mara's biology that had been awakened by her integration into pack life. She could now detect supernatural creatures from considerable distances, distinguish between different types of supernatural energy, and create scent blends that were specifically calibrated to affect non-human biology. Her connection to Caden had strengthened to the point where they could communicate telepathically over short distances, and her influence on pack dynamics was becoming something that even other pack members commented on. "You realize," Elena said one evening as they worked on seating charts, "that what you're doing isn't normal, right? Even for wolf-touched humans." "What do you mean?" "I mean, I've never seen someone integrate into pack hierarchy the way you have. Usually human mates are peripheral, loved and protected, but not really part of the pack's operational structure." Elena paused, studying Mara with curious eyes. "But you're different. Pack members defer to you on certain issues, come to you for advice, look to you for leadership when Caden isn't available. It's like you've become a second alpha." The title sent a chill down Mara's spine. "Is that possible?" "I don't know, but I think we're about to find out." Chapter 16, The Gathering Begins. The autumn gathering officially began on Friday evening with what the supernatural community politely called a welcoming reception, and what everyone else might recognize as the world's most dangerous cocktail party. Picture, if you will, the main hall of Caden's compound transformed into something that looked like it belonged in a luxury resort. Soft lighting, elegant decorations, tables laden with food that accommodated everything from vampire dietary restrictions to fae culinary preferences. Add in live music provided by a trio of musicians who might or might not have been entirely human, and you had the setting for what should have been a lovely evening. Except for the undercurrents of supernatural politics that made every conversation feel like a chess match played with knives. Mara had chosen her outfit carefully. A dress that was elegant enough for formal occasions, but practical enough to move in if things went sideways, in a deep green that complemented her coloring while also indicating her connection to earth and growing things. Subtle makeup that enhanced her features without looking like she was trying too hard. She looked, in short, like someone who belonged exactly where she was. "Nervous?" Caden murmured as they made their way into the hall. "Terrified," she replied honestly. "But ready." The first few hours passed smoothly. Mara found herself in conversations with delegates from various packs, vampire coven representatives who were curious about her aromatherapy work, and even a few fae nobles who seemed genuinely fascinated by her wolf-touched heritage. But she was also acutely aware of the undercurrents of tension flowing through the room. Catherine had arrived with an entourage that screamed power and confidence, and she was working the room like a politician running for office. Subtle comments about pack stability, casual questions about human integration in supernatural leadership, pointed observations about the challenges of mixed-species governance. "She's building a case," Elena murmured during a brief break in conversations. "I know," Mara replied, watching Catherine charm a group of vampire delegates with what appeared to be stories about successful territorial expansions in the Pacific Northwest. But so are we, because while Catherine was talking politics, Mara was demonstrating results. The calming scents she'd layered throughout the hall were working exactly as intended. Conversations that might have turned heated remained civil. Territorial disputes that could have erupted into challenges stayed at the level of polite disagreement, and even the vampires and werewolves were managing to coexist in the same space without anyone bearing fangs. More than one delegate commented on the unusually peaceful atmosphere. More than one asked Caden about his secret weapon for managing supernatural social dynamics. "It's not a secret," he replied each time, his arm around Mara's waist. "It's good leadership and an exceptional mate." The real test came when dinner was served and everyone was seated according to the carefully orchestrated seating chart that had taken weeks to perfect. Ancient pack rivalries were represented at every table, but buffered by neutral parties and strategic placement. Vampire covens that had been feuding for centuries found themselves engaged in surprisingly civil conversations with werewolf packs who had no investment in their conflicts. Fae nobles who typically looked down on werewolf culture were drawn into discussions about territory management and resource allocation that highlighted the practical wisdom of pack governance. And at the head table, Mara found herself seated between two of the most powerful supernatural leaders on the West Coast, managing dinner conversation that touched on everything from interstate pact treaties to sustainable hunting practices in urban environments. She held her own. Not just held her own, she contributed meaningfully to discussions about supernatural law, offered insights into human-werewolf integration that hadn't been considered before, and managed to defuse at least 3 potential conflicts through a combination of diplomatic skill and strategic deployment of calming sense. "Impressive," said Marcus Antonius, an ancient vampire who apparently predated the Roman Empire and was not easily impressed by anyone or anything. "I admit, I came here expecting to witness a political disaster. Instead, I find myself wondering why more packs haven't explored human integration." Catherine, seated just within earshot, smiled tightly. The evening is still young. Chapter 17, The Challenge. Narrator * Catherine made her move during the formal presentations on Saturday morning. The second day of the gathering was traditionally reserved for official business, territory agreements, dispute resolutions, formal announcements, and in this case, leadership evaluations. Mara sat in the audience with other mates and pack family members, watching Caden navigate supernatural politics with the kind of easy competence that reminded everyone why he'd been an effective alpha for over a decade. Everything was proceeding normally until Catherine stood during the open forum period. "I'd like to address a matter of pack security," she announced, her voice carrying easily through the hall. Specifically, the recent trend of human integration in werewolf pack leadership and its potential implications for territorial stability. Here it came. "While we all appreciate the romantic appeal of human-werewolf bonds," Catherine continued, "we must consider the practical consequences. Human mates, however well-meaning, lack the supernatural instincts necessary for pack protection. They cannot detect supernatural threats, cannot contribute to pack defense, and represent vulnerable targets that enemies can exploit." Murmurs rippled through the audience. This was exactly the argument everyone had been expecting, delivered with Catherine's trademark combination of reasonable logic and poisonous implications. "Furthermore," Catherine said, warming to her theme, "human emotional attachments can compromise alpha decision-making. An alpha who prioritizes his human mate's safety over pack survival becomes a liability to his entire territory." Caden started to rise, but Catherine wasn't finished. "I therefore formally request a leadership competency evaluation, as provided for under Section 47 of the Territorial Governance Code." The hall went dead silent. Leadership competency evaluations were serious business. They were the legal mechanism by which the supernatural community could remove an alpha who was deemed unfit to maintain territorial security. They were also rare, complicated, and potentially deadly. But they were also absolutely legal. "The evaluation process requires 3 tests," Catherine continued, clearly having done her homework. "First, a demonstration of pack loyalty and stability. Second, a territorial defense exercise. Third, a leadership decision-making scenario under pressure." She paused, letting the implications sink in. If Alpha Voss's pack is truly stable and secure, if his human mate truly enhances rather than compromises his leadership abilities, then he should welcome the opportunity to demonstrate that strength publicly. It was a masterful trap. Refusing the evaluation would look like an admission of weakness. Accepting it meant subjecting both Caden and the pack to tests that were specifically designed to expose vulnerabilities. And Catherine had had months to plan how to exploit those vulnerabilities. But she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that Mara would be a passive observer in this process, a weakness to be protected rather than a strength to be deployed. Which is why everyone in the hall was surprised when Mara stood up. "I accept the challenge on behalf of our pack," she said clearly. The silence that followed was the kind that makes your ears ring. "Mara," Caden said quietly, "you don't have the legal standing to." "Actually, I do." She looked directly at Catherine, her voice steady and sure. "As a wolf-touched descendant with territorial inheritance rights, I have the legal authority to speak for pack interests. And I formally accept your leadership evaluation request." She paused, letting her own implications sink in. "But I propose a modification to the standard testing format." What Mara proposed was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of tests designed to expose weakness, she suggested demonstrations designed to show strength. Rather than artificial scenarios designed to create stress, she said, "Why don't we demonstrate real pack management in action? Host the evaluation tests as part of the gathering itself. Let the supernatural community see how our pack actually functions under normal operational conditions. Catherine's expression flickered for just a moment before settling back into composed confidence. And if you fail? If we fail, we'll formally cede territorial claims and accept reassignment under another Alpha's protection. Mara's voice didn't waver. But if we succeed, you'll formally acknowledge our pack's stability and end all challenges to our territorial sovereignty. Agreed, Catherine said immediately. Too immediately, Mara realized with a chill. Catherine had been planning for this exact scenario, which meant she had something up her sleeve that she was very confident would ensure Mara and Caden's failure. ##### Chapter 18. The tests begin, 131:00, 138:00. The first test, pack loyalty and stability, began immediately. In traditional evaluations, this test involved artificial scenarios designed to create stress and division within the pack. Members would be separated and questioned about their loyalty to the Alpha, their confidence in his leadership, and their willingness to follow his orders even in dangerous situations. But Mara's modification meant that instead of artificial testing, the evaluation would be conducted through observation of normal pack functions during the remainder of the gathering, which should have been an advantage, except that Catherine had apparently spent considerable time studying Caden's pack dynamics and had identified exactly which pressure points to exploit. The first incident happened during lunch preparation. Several pack members were working in the kitchen, managing the complex logistics of feeding nearly 100 supernatural delegates with wildly different dietary needs. It was the kind of high-stress, high-coordination situation that required everyone to work together smoothly. That's when one of Catherine's pack members casually mentioned that he'd heard rumors about tensions within Caden's leadership structure. "Nothing serious," he said with the kind of casual tone that indicated it was definitely serious. "Just talk about whether the Alpha spends too much time focused on his mate's needs and not enough time on pack business." The comment was perfectly calculated to create doubt and division. Pack members started second-guessing decisions, questioning whether their contributions were valued, wondering if their Alpha was truly putting pack interests first. Within an hour, the smooth coordination that usually characterized pack activities had devolved into awkward hesitation and careful politeness that screamed of underlying tension. But Catherine had underestimated one crucial factor. Mara's integration into the pack wasn't just romantic attachment to the Alpha. It was genuine functional leadership that the pack members had come to depend on. When Sam started getting overwhelmed by the kitchen chaos, and her anxiety scent began affecting everyone around her, she didn't go to Caden for help. She went to Mara. When Robert's arthritis flared up from the stress, and he needed someone to take over his coordination duties, he passed the responsibility to Mara without even thinking about it. When Elena found herself in a heated discussion with vampire delegates about territorial boundaries, she caught Mara's eye across the room and received a subtle nod that said, "You've got this, I trust your judgment." By evening, the pack had not only recovered from Catherine's psychological manipulation, but had demonstrated something unprecedented. A functional dual leadership structure where pack members felt comfortable seeking guidance from both their Alpha and his mate, depending on the nature of the problem. "That's not normal," Marcus Antonius commented to a fellow vampire delegate as they watched Mara coordinate evening activities while Caden handled formal diplomatic conversations. "Human mates don't typically integrate into pack hierarchy at that level." "No," his companion agreed. "They don't." Narrator * the second test, territorial defense, was scheduled for Sunday morning, and Catherine had clearly been saving her best strategies for this one. Traditional territorial defense tests involved simulated attacks or invasions that tested a pack's ability to respond quickly and effectively to threats. But under Mara's modified format, the test would evaluate how well the pack handled actual security challenges during the gathering itself. Which might have been fine, except that Catherine had arranged for there to be actual security challenges. The first incident occurred at dawn, when perimeter security detected unauthorized supernatural signatures in the forest surrounding the compound. Not close enough to be an immediate threat, but close enough to require investigation and potential defensive action. Standard protocol would be for the Alpha to assess the situation and deploy pack members accordingly. But Catherine was watching for signs that Caden's judgment was compromised by concern for his human mate's safety, that he might make tactical errors based on emotional rather than strategic thinking. What she got instead was a masterclass in coordinated leadership. Caden immediately shifted into alpha mode, deploying pack members for perimeter patrol and threat assessment. But rather than treating Mara as a liability to be protected, he consulted with her about the intruder's scent signatures and what they might indicate about supernatural type and potential threat level. Rogue wolves, Mara said after analyzing the scent samples that patrol teams brought back. Recently turned, probably within the last 6 months. Hungry, desperate, but not organized enough to be a real threat to the compound. Recommendations? Caden asked, and the casual way he deferred to her expertise made several observing delegates exchange glances. Humanitarian contact rather than aggressive defense, she said immediately. They're refugees, not attackers. Offer food and assistance. See if we can connect them with packs that have space for new members. It was exactly the right call, as became clear when the intruders turned out to be a family of newly turned werewolves who'd been displaced from their original territory and were simply looking for help. But Catherine wasn't finished. The second incident was more serious. During the afternoon business sessions, a fight broke out between delegates from 2 vampire covens who'd apparently been nursing a grudge for the better part of a century. Vampire fights weren't like werewolf fights. They were faster, more vicious, and potentially lethal to bystanders who got caught in the crossfire. Within seconds, what had been a civilized political gathering turned into a supernatural brawl that threatened to destroy not just the gathering but potentially the compound itself. This was the kind of crisis that separated competent alphas from truly exceptional ones. The wrong response could turn a localized conflict into a supernatural war. The right response required split-second decision-making, perfect coordination, and probably a good bit of luck. Caden didn't hesitate. He stepped into the center of the conflict, using his alpha presence to create a zone of calm authority that gave everyone a chance to step back and think. But while he was handling the immediate tactical situation, Mara was implementing a strategic solution. She'd been carrying samples of her calming blends specifically for this kind of emergency, and within moments she'd deployed scent-based pacification that took the edge off everyone's supernatural aggression. Not enough to incapacitate anyone, but enough to create space for rational thought and diplomatic resolution. The fight ended as quickly as it had begun, with all parties intact and the underlying dispute redirected into formal mediation sessions. Impressive teamwork, commented Elena Vasquez, an alpha from the Southern California pack who'd been watching the entire situation with professional interest. Most pairs would have gotten in each other's way during a crisis like that. Catherine's smile was getting thinner by the hour. Chapter 19, the final test. The third test, leadership decision-making under pressure, was scheduled for Sunday evening, and by this point, Catherine was clearly getting desperate. The first 2 tests had not only failed to expose weaknesses in Caden and Mara's leadership partnership, but had actually demonstrated strengths that most traditional alpha structures didn't possess. The supernatural community was taking notice, and the political implications were starting to shift in ways that Catherine definitely hadn't intended, which is probably why she decided to escalate. The final test, under traditional evaluation protocols, involved presenting the alpha with an impossible choice. Typically something where protecting the pack required sacrificing individual members, or where personal loyalties conflicted with territorial responsibilities. The goal was to see how leaders performed when every option was bad and someone was going to get hurt no matter what. Catherine's version was more personal. "I have information," she announced during the formal evening session, regarding a serious threat to pack security that requires immediate alpha attention. She gestured, and 2 of her pack members escorted someone into the hall, someone who made Mara's blood run cold. Jace, her brother, looking pale and scared and very much like someone who'd been kidnapped and held against his will. "We intercepted Mr. Lowe this afternoon," Catherine continued smoothly, attempting to access pack territory with several individuals of questionable supernatural affiliation. When questioned, he revealed information about planned attacks on pack leadership, specifically targeting the alpha's human mate. Mara felt Caden's fury through their bond, felt his wolf pressing against the edges of his human form with barely contained violence. Every instinct he possessed was screaming at him to protect his mate, to eliminate the threat, to tear apart anyone who dared target what was his. But Catherine wasn't done. However, our investigation suggests that Mr. Lowe may not be an entirely willing participant in this threat. His recent medical treatments have left him vulnerable to supernatural coercion, and there are indications that he's being manipulated by parties unknown. She paused, letting the implications sink in. This presents Alpha Voss with an interesting choice. He can prioritize pack security by treating Mr. Lowe as a hostile threat and responding accordingly. Or he can prioritize his mate's emotional well-being by treating her brother as a victim in need of protection, potentially exposing the pack to continued danger. It was a masterpiece of psychological manipulation. Catherine had found the one scenario guaranteed to create maximum conflict between Caden's responsibilities as an alpha and his love for Mara. If he chose pack security, he'd have to authorize harsh interrogation or possibly elimination of Mara's brother, destroying their relationship and proving that human attachments were indeed vulnerabilities that compromised alpha judgment. If he chose to protect Jace, he'd be putting personal loyalty above pack safety, validating every argument Catherine had made about human mates being dangerous liabilities. Either way, Catherine won. Except she'd made one crucial miscalculation. She'd assumed that Caden would have to choose between protecting the pack and protecting Mara's family. She hadn't considered that maybe, just maybe, there was a third option. Narrator * Mara stood up slowly, her voice cutting through the tense silence like a blade. "Catherine," she said pleasantly, "that's a very interesting story. Would you mind if I examine the evidence?" "Evidence? Well, you mentioned that my brother was intercepted with individuals of questionable supernatural affiliation, and that there were indications of coercion and planned attacks." Mara smiled with perfect politeness. "I assume you have documentation of these threats, witness statements, physical evidence of the alleged supernatural manipulation?" Catherine's confident expression flickered for just a moment. "Because," Mara continued, walking closer to where Jace was standing between his guards, "as someone with wolf-touched heritage and legal standing in supernatural law, I have the right to review any evidence used in formal leadership evaluations." She was close enough now to really look at her brother, to smell his scent signature, to read the emotions rolling off him in waves. Fear, yes. Confusion. Exhaustion. But not guilt. Not the desperate panic of someone who'd been caught in a legitimate conspiracy. And underneath it all, the lingering scent of something that made Mara's blood boil. Supernatural coercion. Not the kind used by mysterious third parties to manipulate him into threatening the pack. The kind used by werewolves to kidnap a sick human and force him to play along with elaborate political theater. "Interesting," Mara said softly. "Jace, tell me, how exactly did these mysterious conspirators convince you to attack a werewolf pack? What did they offer you?" Jace looked confused. "I what? Attack? I don't. Mara, I came here looking for you. These people said you were in trouble, that they were pack security bringing me to help." Narrator * the silence that followed was the kind that precedes explosions. Because what Jace had just revealed was that Catherine hadn't intercepted a genuine threat to pack security. She'd kidnapped Mara's brother, fed him a story about his sister being in danger, and then used his presence to create an artificial crisis designed to force Caden into an impossible choice. It wasn't a leadership test. It was entrapment. And under supernatural law, it was also an act of war. Caden's voice, when he finally spoke, was soft and dangerous. "Catherine, you used coercion against a human under my protection to manipulate a formal leadership evaluation." "Aye, the threats were real, we had intelligence. You kidnapped my mate's brother and terrorized him into believing his sister was in danger so that you could create a political crisis." Caden's eyes were beginning to glow. "Do you have any idea how many laws you just broke?" What followed was a rapid education in the finer points of supernatural legal code. Coercion of humans under pack protection. Serious violation of territorial sovereignty. Manipulation of formal leadership evaluations. Grounds for permanent expulsion from the supernatural community. Falsification of security threats. Potential act of war. And kidnapping the family member of a wolf-touched human with territorial inheritance rights? That was, according to Elena's quick consultation of legal precedents, something that hadn't happened in over a century, specifically because the last person who tried it had ended up being challenged to single combat by 12 different alphas and hadn't survived the experience. Catherine's political career was over. Her pack's territorial claims were forfeit. And she was lucky that Caden was civilized enough to settle for legal consequences, rather than the traditional werewolf approach to dealing with threats to his mate. "The leadership evaluation is concluded," announced the senior delegate who'd been overseeing the formal proceedings. "Based on the evidence presented, This panel finds that Alpha Voss and his pack have demonstrated exceptional stability, security, and leadership competence. He paused, looking directly at Catherine. Furthermore, the charges of evaluation manipulation and human coercion will be referred to the Territorial Council for formal prosecution. Chapter 20, New Beginnings. The autumn gathering concluded the next morning with what could only be described as a complete vindication of everything Mara and Caden had been trying to prove. Delegates who'd arrived expecting to witness a political disaster instead left with a new model for supernatural leadership. The integration of human insight and werewolf instincts hadn't weakened the pack. It had created something stronger and more adaptable than traditional pack structures. More than one alpha approached Caden privately to ask about the practical aspects of human integration. Several vampire covens expressed interest in consulting with Mara about scent-based conflict resolution. Even the Fey nobles, who typically regarded werewolf culture with polite disdain, admitted that they'd been impressed by the innovative approaches to territorial management they'd witnessed. "You realize," Elena said as they watched the last of the departing delegates load into their vehicles, "that you've just started a supernatural political revolution?" "Have we?" Mara asked, settling more comfortably against Caden's side on the front porch steps. 3 other packs have already asked for advice about human integration programs. The vampire covens are talking about hiring human consultants for scent-based mediation. The Fae are wondering if human creativity might offer solutions to some of their traditional territorial disputes. Elena grinned. "You've made mixed species cooperation fashionable." But the most important conversation happened that evening, after all the guests had left and the compound had settled back into normal routines. Jace, who'd spent the day recovering from his ordeal and receiving medical attention for the stress-related complications from his treatment, finally cornered Mara in the kitchen. "I need to apologize," he said without preamble. "For all of it. The car theft, the debt, putting you in this situation. I never meant for any of this to happen." Mara looked at her brother, really looked at him, and realized that something had fundamentally changed. The boyish irresponsibility that had characterized their entire relationship was gone, replaced by something more mature and thoughtful. "The cancer scare changed things," he continued quietly. "Made me think about what actually matters, about the people I might lose if I keep making stupid decisions. And watching you this weekend, seeing how you've built this life, this family." He shook his head. "I want to be better. I want to be someone you can be proud of instead of someone you have to clean up after." "I've always been proud of you," Mara said softly, "even when you drove me crazy. But you shouldn't have had to take care of me for so long. That was supposed to be temporary, after Mom and Dad died. Instead, I let it become permanent." Jace met her eyes. "I'm going to get my life together. Real job, real apartment, real responsibility. It's time." The conversation that followed was long overdue. Years of accumulated resentment and guilt and love all finally spoken aloud. Jace's acknowledgement of how his choices had affected Mara's life. Mara's admission that sometimes taking care of him had been easier than figuring out what she wanted for herself. The recognition that they were both adults now, capable of having a relationship based on choice rather than obligation. But the most important part was Jace's genuine understanding of what Mara had found with the pack. "I was scared for you at first," he admitted. "The whole werewolf thing seemed insane, and I thought maybe you were just doing it because you felt like you had to, because of my debt. And now I can see that this is where you belong. Not just with Caden, but with all of them. You're happier than I've seen you since, maybe ever." He smiled. "And you're scary when you're protecting people you care about. I had no idea you had that in you. Neither did I, to be honest." "Well, I'm glad you figured it out." That Catherine woman had no idea what she was dealing with. Later that night, as Mara and Caden settled into their evening routine, she found herself reflecting on how much had changed since that first terrifying night when he'd knocked on her trailer door. "Any regrets?" he asked, sensing the direction of her thoughts through their bond. "About which part? Signing a contract to be your emotional support human? Living with 15 werewolves? Starting a supernatural political revolution? Or falling in love with an alpha who turns into a giant wolf? Any of it? All of it?" She considered the question seriously. The past few months had been the most challenging, terrifying, and transformative of her life. She'd been forced to confront parts of herself she'd never known existed, to develop strengths she'd never needed, to build a life that was nothing like anything she'd ever imagined. "No regrets," she said finally. "But I do have one request. Anything. Next time you need to prove pack stability to the supernatural community, maybe we could just host a nice dinner party instead of a full-scale political gathering? His laugh rumbled through his chest and into hers through their bond. I'll see what I can do. Chapter 21, Ever After. 6 months later, Mara stood in the same spot where she'd first met Caden, but everything else had changed. The trailer park had been replaced by a proper business facility, a custom aromatherapy lab that served supernatural clients across the country, housed in a building that straddled the line between human and pack territory. Her client list now included vampire covens, fey courts, and werewolf packs from coast to coast, all seeking her expertise in scent-based conflict resolution and emotional regulation. But the most significant change was the addition to the pack. "How are you feeling?" Elena asked, settling onto the couch beside Mara with the kind of careful attention that had become routine over the past few months. "Huge," Mara replied, resting her hands on her considerably expanded belly. "And tired. And hungry. And did I mention huge?" "You're carrying werewolf twins," Elena pointed out reasonably. "Huge is pretty much inevitable." The pregnancy had been unexpected but not unwelcome, a development that had sent ripples of excitement through both the pack and the broader supernatural community. Werewolf-human hybrids were rare, and children born to wolf-touched humans were rarer still. Everyone was curious to see what abilities the babies might inherit, what new possibilities they might represent. But for Mara and Caden, the anticipation was more personal. They were about to become parents, about to add 2 new lives to a pack that had already become the most important thing in their world. "Any word from the doctor about timing?" Elena asked. "Soon," Mara said. "Very soon, if the way they're moving around is any indication." As if summoned by her words, Caden appeared in the doorway, his expression shifting from casual inquiry to focused attention the moment he saw her. "Contractions?" he asked. "Maybe. Probably. Yes." He was beside her instantly, one hand on her back, the other reaching for his phone to call the pack doctor. But Mara caught his wrist. "Not yet," she said. "I want a few more minutes of just us before everything gets crazy." So they sat together in the quiet afternoon light, feeling their children move and kick, and prepare to enter a world that was far more complex and wonderful than either of their parents had ever imagined. "Are you scared?" Mara asked. "Terrified," Caden admitted. "What if I'm a terrible father? What if I can't protect them? What if they inherit my wolf's aggression issues? Then we'll figure it out together," she said simply. "Just like we've figured out everything else." Through their bond, she felt his wolf settle at her words, felt the deep contentment that had become his baseline emotional state since their mating. The chronic hypervigilance that had defined his life for 15 years was gone, replaced by a quieter strength that came from knowing he wasn't facing the world alone anymore. "Besides," Mara added with a grin, "if they cause too much trouble, I'll just develop a scent blend that makes them sleepy." "You would, wouldn't you?" "I absolutely would. I've spent the last 9 months researching aromatherapy applications for infant werewolves. I am prepared." The twins, a boy and a girl who would grow up to be the first documented case of human-werewolf hybrids with active shifting abilities, were born 6 hours later, surrounded by a pack that welcomed them with the kind of joy usually reserved for miracles. Which, in many ways, they were. But that's a story for another day. For now, it's enough to know that Mara Lowe, who'd started this journey as a broke perfume chemist paying off her brother's debt, ended it as the co-leader of one of the most innovative and successful werewolf packs in North America. That Caden Voss, who'd spent 15 years believing that leadership meant carrying every burden alone, learned that sometimes the strongest thing you can do is let someone help share the weight. That Jace Lowe got his life together, found a career he loved, and became the kind of brother his sister could be proud of instead of worried about. And that sometimes, when you think you're just solving one problem, like a brother's debt or an alpha's insomnia, you end up discovering something you never knew you were looking for. You end up finding home. Love isn't always a fairy tale. Sometimes it's messier than that, more complicated, more real. Sometimes it involves contracts and debts and political conspiracies, and learning to navigate werewolf pack dynamics, while figuring out how to manage supernatural aromatherapy for clients who could literally eat you if your custom blends don't work properly. Sometimes love is a broke perfume chemist and an insomniac alpha werewolf figuring out how to build a life together that's stronger than either of them could manage alone. But when it works, when you find the person who makes you braver and calmer and more yourself than you've ever been, It's worth every complicated, terrifying, wonderful moment of the journey. Even if that journey involves more werewolf politics than you ever wanted to deal with. Thank you for joining me for Her Brother's Debt, the story of how a life debt became a love story, and how sometimes the best families are the ones you choose rather than the ones you're born into. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and let me know in the comments what supernatural romance you'd like to hear next. Until then, sweet dreams. And may your own love story be just complicated enough to keep things interesting.